Sure. Ani, bonjour, G.R Gritt, Indigenous, Sudbury, Ontario, Dunjaba. Salut, bonjour. Hello, my name is G.R Gritt, coming to you from Sudbury or from Swakamak. Still getting used to that, even though it's my language. Um, on Robinson Huron Treaty territory, territory of the Tipmishing on Anishinaabe and of Wampanoag First Nation, and it's really great to be here. So, salut, bonjour. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you for joining us. Ashley?
Bonjour, Tanshi. My name is Ashley Moreau. I'm a Two-Spirit Métis artist, originally from Treaty 3 territory in Eagle River, Ontario. If you haven't heard of it, that's not a surprise. I currently live in Thunder Bay, Ontario, which is the Robinson Superior Treaty. And I'm the chair of Thunder Pride, as well as I sit on the Fierté Canada Pride Board as the VP of membership. So thank you so much for having me.
It's great to have you here. Next up is Sonia.
Hi, I'm Sonia. I'm from Nigeria originally. I moved here to Canada 8 years ago, and I lived in Sudbury, Montreal, and Toronto. I'm an architectural designer and an artist.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Tafari?
Hello, I'm Tafari Anthony. I'm a singer-songwriter based out of Toronto, Ontario. I went to college in Sudbury, and I've been back many times.
Perfect. And last but not least, Teddy.
Ani bonjour. My Anishinaabe name is Yellow Star Woman. I sit in the Wolf Clan, and I'm originally from Batchewana First Nation, grew up on Rankin Reserve in Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario. And I visited and I've done a little bit of work in Sudbury over the years. And I'm very happy and honored to be on this panel today with all of you.
Perfect. Thank you so much for all of you for joining us today. So we'll start off with our first question. All of the questions throughout this period will be open to anyone who wants to answer. And so feel free to just jump in. You don't have to kind of wait for me to select you to speak. So question number one is, as a queer person, can you talk to us about your experience of living in the North? What are some of the challenges and issues that you faced?
I can start.
Ashley, perfect. Thank you, Sonia.
Oh, Ashley, would you like to go first? I wanted to start because I think I have a different kind of experience with the North. Because I'm coming from a country where it's illegal to be queer, I have a really good experience with being queer in the North. It's not perfect, obviously, but it's much better than the alternative. When I came in here, I was embraced by the community. I didn't really have any issues. They didn't really care where I came from or what I did. I was just immediately accepted. So I feel like things are a little bit freer here for me. So I'd be interested to hear people who actually had to grow up here.
Ashley, how about your experience?
Yeah, sure. So my experience, I would say coming out queer in Eagle River, town of 200, just to give everyone a little bit of where that is. It's kind of the geographic center between Winnipeg and Thunder Bay, where there's not really a whole lot. So my experience of growing up there was very different. I moved to Thunder Bay to find a little bit of myself and acceptance, I'd say. My experience wasn't the greatest living there. Since then, no shade to Dryden, because that's my hometown kinda. They've grown for a little town, a little city, and they've had their maybe second or third Pride events and stuff like that. So it's great. I feel like moving to Thunder Bay, I was finally able to hold my girlfriend's hand and not check behind my shoulder as much. I don't know if you'll ever lose that, to be honest, when you come from a really small town. But I definitely find it's a lot more freeing being in Thunder Bay. And funny enough, a lot of people from Thunder Bay, just because I've been here for 15 years now, I find it really interesting because everyone from here moves to a bigger city to find that acceptance, where I moved to Thunder Bay to find that little piece of acceptance for myself. So the perspective is really interesting.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I really appreciate it. GR, I noticed you discovered the raise hand feature. Wonderful. Do you mind sharing your experience a little bit?
I think Tafari had raised his hand first. You go ahead.
Sure, yeah, I can go now. Yeah, my experience is much like Sonia. So I grew up in Toronto, which you would think, I'd feel more comfortable being queer here. But when I came out here, I moved to Sudbury. And I don't know, I found being in the smaller town and maybe the fact that nobody knew who I was, I could just live my life as I wanted to. And I didn't really face anything directly that kind of triggered me in that way. So I felt like Sudbury was almost like a little bit of a safe haven for me, as kind of describing myself as a queer person.
Thank you so much for sharing that. GR, go ahead.
Right on. I grew up between Sudbury and North Bay in a little town called Warren. And for me growing up, like I knew really, really young that I was queer and just didn't have the language for that to even like self-identify or anything. And, over the years of growing up, when I found people around, like if they were talking about anyone who was kind of queer that or anything, they'd be like, oh, so and so, they're a lesbian. They'd have to like whisper it. And so not that I ever heard anything inherently wrong with being uh gay until like getting to high school, and then it was used like as a basically a slur, right, of being like, oh my god, that's so gay, like saying things that way, or people being harmed because people thought they were maybe gay. Like for me, up until about high school, like there wasn't anyone who said that was bad, but because there's nothing ever said that it's good or it's acceptable, and it's always something that's kind of like whispered around, you kind of just know that like, oh, okay, I'm different and that's bad, so I'll just keep that to myself for as long as possible. So then, in high school, just seeing people who are like bullied and roughed up a bit for, being seen as gay, or even just like the way that people would treat like folks who were maybe like bisexual or lesbian or anything, like there was no one who was really out when I went to school. I went to school in the French River, and yeah, so for me, it took me a long time to even like come out to my parents, and even then, it was like someone in the community like outed me, and it was a race for me to like tell my parents before the rumor mill like arrived to them on their front door. So for me, like, um, I can't say that anyone has ever said anything really bad to my face, but it's more so what happens like to you outside of your circle. So whether it be rumors or like one time in Sudbury, like folks threw Dairy Queen ice cream at us and like called us queers or whatever through like we saw the car go in. We were like walking down the Kingsway, and you know, um, they went to Dairy Queen and then they came out and they threw the ice cream at us, and I was like, "You just wasted money. Why'd you do that?" And then we were just at McDonald's and we're like, "We feel bad," so we went and got our own ice cream and then felt better. Basically, we're just waiting for a bus to come by. So for me, like I did experience some stuff here in Sudbury, or even just like even before I came out as trans or even had a language for that. Because again, if you don't see that around you, but you have feelings, but you don't know how to describe them, like it feels like there's nothing you can do about it. So like, but hearing just how folks in the queer community were kind of like side eyeing trans folks at that time. This would have been 12 years ago, 13 years ago, because I was here and then Montreal, then here and then up in Yellowknife for 10 years, and then I came back. So anyways, the times that I did spend in Sudbury living here, there was transphobia happening, but I wasn't openly trans. I just didn't even know yet. So I know that that is definitely in the community, in the queer community, but then also outside. So I can definitely relate to like Ashley's stories of like holding your girlfriend's hand. And like I remember walking in the New Sudbury Mall holding my girlfriend's hand, because at that point I was a more feminine person, identified as a lesbian. And yeah, like you're holding hands and people would just stop and like watch you, and you're like, do I need to run right now? Like, I don't know. So I can definitely relate to some of the stories that folks have already mentioned, and also experienced like, yeah, the need to kind of go elsewhere, like Yellowknife, in order to just like feel like I can live my whole full life without people, people knowing me for so long that I felt like I maybe couldn't change, or it'd have been harder. Like I think having gone to Yellowknife, although that wasn't the purpose, it helped me to become who I am and feel more okay with like who I am. Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I really appreciate it. And I know you bring up a really important point about not having the words to be able to describe that kind of stuff. I know I've experienced a very similar thing. And it wasn't until I was actually accepted into the community that I finally found the words to describe what I was feeling. So it's definitely something that a lot of people, especially here in Northern Ontario, do experience because they don't have that access to queer culture and queer community in the same ways that you may find in other areas. Alex, do you mind speaking maybe to your experience as well?
Yeah, so I think a little bit to follow up on what you just said, Katlyn, I think that, you know, it's already tough enough for folks who live in the North to feel connected to those who are outside of their community. And I think it's even more difficult in a place like Sudbury, which is a literal hole in the ground, right? Where, you know, queer folks here, I don't think there is, like what I've noticed is there isn't a queer community. I think there are queer communities, right? There's like little pockets of queerness sprinkled around the city. But what that means is that, you know, there's no transmission of history, right? We don't know each other's stories. We don't know the struggles that preceded us. And a lot of queer youth, because they feel like they can't, because they can't get that sense of community, that they can't experience life as their authentic selves, often leave. So we sort of end up with a situation here where there's a lack of community, but not necessarily the people power to make it happen.
Sure. Thank you for sharing that. Sonia, maybe you could talk a little bit about your experience as well here in Sudbury.
My experience with being queer in Sudbury, I found that I was afforded the opportunity to come out here, but I never had to. There was never a reason for me to tell people that this is my sexuality, this is my gender expression, and I'm still struggling with knowing what exactly that is. But I was guided by my community. Like, I don't really feel that there was ever a real struggle. I am still struggling with language as well. Like, I'm not sure what the right words to describe myself is. And a lot of the languages in Nigeria don't even have pronouns. Like, everybody is considered the exact same. So of course there are still like gender roles, but it's not enforced by pronouns. And so I'm really struggling with that kind of thing. As you can see, I have 3 different pronouns. Neither of them bother me, but in the North, I'm happy that I didn't have to come out. I could just live my life. And I'm sure that part of that is because I present in a very feminine way, which is way more widely accepted. And to some extent it is fetishized, but because of that, people leave me and my girlfriend a lot more because we look more feminine. So I would say that.
Thank you so much for sharing. I really appreciate it. Tafari, maybe you could talk a little bit about, because you're not currently living in the North right now, what it's like living where you are now in comparison to the North. And have you found that there are any differences between living in Toronto and living in the North?
I mean, obviously Toronto has a lot more resources that are obvious. So there's that difference. And I feel like Toronto, if you want to find your space or your community as a queer person, like, it's pretty easy to do, right? In Sudbury, like, again, I know I said I didn't really experience any turmoil with coming out there or anything like that, but I feel like because I moved there, and I moved there because my partner was there, like, I just was engulfed into his group of people, right? So whatever his queer world was, that became my queer world, and then I didn't know anything outside of that. So I think it wasn't really until I moved back to Toronto that I actually could, you know, find like what kind of queer person am I and what kind of community do I want to be in, that kind of thing. But me personally, I feel like in a smaller town like Sudbury, even though it may not seem as widely accepted, I feel like once you do find your crew or your tribe or whatever you want to call it, that support system can feel a lot more welcoming than in a big city like Toronto, that even though the resources are vast and everywhere, it still feels, to me personally, a lot more isolating. oddly enough.
That's really interesting to know. And thank you so much for sharing that insight. Teddy, why don't you talk about your experience and kind of maybe some of the challenges that you faced living in the North?
Yeah, Miigwech, thank you. I came out at a very young age. I think I knew that I was different when I was a very young child. So I think I was like around 10 years old. I realized that I was different. There was a lovely show on television called Saved by the Bell. And one specific character stuck out to me, and that was Zach Morris. And there was just something about his blonde hair and his brown eyes and his really big cell phone that really just made me say, yes, that's the one for me. And I don't know what being gay is, but I think I'm gay now. So I'm not saying that television made me gay, but it definitely helped. So for myself, and that was the other thing too, even though I didn't know what those feelings were, and my attraction for Zach Morris was really real, I didn't know what that language was. So, however, there are other people telling me what the language, asking me what that language, asking me if I was gay or homosexual, and I'm like, well, what does a gay or homosexual mean? Like, what do they do? Like, where can I find them? And they're like, well, it's basically when like another guy likes another guy sexually. And I'm like, well, we're like 12 or 13 years old, so I didn't even know we were having those conversations yet, but okay. So for me, I'm like, I didn't know what I said. I couldn't even tell them. I was like, I don't think I am, because I just don't know what that means. So for me, I needed to find what those questions were, because for me, like, I'm an Aquarius, and I'm like, my background's in social work and theater and bingo. So I ask a lot of questions, right? So for myself, I was like, okay, well, what does a homosexual mean? So, and we didn't have a Facebook, we didn't have internet back then. We didn't have a computer for a very long time growing up on the reserve, even though my reserve was like in the city limits of Sault Ste. Marie, which has also complicated things when it came to my identity as being an Indigenous person. I was like, okay, what does it mean to be an Indigenous person and living on a reserve, not knowing what a reserve is really? And then also being racialized, because I come up from a family who's, my father and my sister are both white passing, and then my mother and my older sister are browner than I am, and I'm kind of like in the middle somewhere. So I was getting treated differently at a very young age, and I just had no idea what any of that language was. But luckily, I was able to find it in homosexual. I was able to find in HIV/AIDS resource books, kind of bleak as a young child, but it was the only resource I had to learn about who I am. So like, that was the one thing where I can understand who I was as an an homosexual person, but like also understanding like the facets of safe sex and sex, and like protecting myself when I am engaging in sex practices. And I was like 12 years old, and I'm like, okay, where do you even find condoms? They must be so expensive. You must have to go to a special condom store, because you never see them in the grocery store. So, but these are questions that I had to start thinking about, because like it was very important to me. And in Sault Ste. Marie, we never had any of that. We never had an active pride movement until like 7 or 8 years ago, which I helped start, or to help refresh again, because there was nothing happening. And the only reason why I got into LGBTQ advocacy is because like before, I thought I was going to be I thought I was going to be in theater. I thought I was going to be an actor, and like working in Toronto or working in New York, being a superstar. And I'd started in Manitowoning, so I lived in Manitowoning and Manitoulin Island, and that experience was in itself kind of a beautiful experience as well, because I was working with Indigenous people, but I was also working with other Two-Spirit and LGBTQ people in a small community of Manitowoning. But at the same time, during in the media, there was numerous children and youth dying of suicide and violence in Canada and the United States, and it almost seemed like every week it was like another name and another age, and that name, and every week the name changed and the age changed too, and that age kept on getting younger and younger and younger, until a young youth passed away on Manitoulin Island, who identified as who came out, and then a portion of the family couldn't accept them, so they died of suicide. And that just made me think of like how many of the other kids in my community in Sault Ste. Marie are going through the same thing, and what resources are there, or what resources aren't there that the community needs to start building. So I dropped out of that theater project or theater program in Manitowoning, and went to Sault College in Sault Ste. Marie. and started to become a social worker. And then a few years of doing that and doing some advocacy in Sault Ste. Marie, I moved to Toronto to work with EGAL Canada. And I lasted 4 months there because I realized that like not-for-profit structures are really, and like systems, so many systems are not built for Indigenous people, let alone queer people, let alone racialized people. So, and that's the same thing with the nonprofit sectors where you might be working with an agency where they're like, hey, they're very progressive, but when you start working with them, you start getting in the background, you're like, okay, so it's probably the same thing, just there's just a couple of BIPOC people at the front of the line. So but real work is really being done. And that's the work that I do now as a private consultant, where I can actually have that freedom to say like, okay, so this is where you're going wrong. And then also have the freedom of leaving afterwards and ordering a pizza and calling it a day. So that's a little bit about my experience.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing. And I'm really thankful that you brought up the fact that your identity as an Indigenous person, as well as your identity within the 2S LGBTQ+ community, do intersect. And that is a really nice segue kind of into our next question. As we know, each person's identities and experiences don't exist independently, right? And they overlap and intersect, often creating a complex convergence of oppression. So the next question is, how have the intersections of your own identities impacted your life? And maybe we could start with Sonia.
Hi, yeah. So, I said I've been accepted into the community as a queer person, I have, but, there starts to become all these problems when you add the racialized aspect to it, because a lot of people who grew up in the North didn't have maybe a diverse understanding. I mean, there's nothing anyway, even if you're white, for you to understand your identity to the fullest. But once you add race to it, it becomes a game of just taking what you can get and just being like, okay, well, at least they understand this part of me that no one else has understood. So I'm willing to let a lot of like racial injustices within the queer community slide, which isn't a great thing, but it's like the closest I can get. Because also coming from Nigeria, a lot of people that move to Canada as well, they're coming from a culture that is fiercely homophobic. So even though I want to be part of this community with my Black brothers and sisters, there is this issue where they've been raised to be homophobic. So I can't fit into a group of people that look like me. But when I'm getting into the queer community and there's only a few of us that are racialized or visibly racialized, you kind of just have to take what you can get. And that's the balancing act you have to kind of play. And you're the only one kind of educating people, but you don't want to start trouble within your community because, there's, we're held to a high standard where we all have to get along, all queer people have to be friends. Like there's never any room for argument. There's never any room for bringing in new education because we've all faced something so messed up that, nobody wants to be called racist if they're queer because they're just like, no, I understand what it's like to struggle. How can I be racist? You can be racist because you're not taught this aspect of intersections. So that's something I kind of face. I'm struggling with presenting myself as more masculine because there is already this expectation for Black women to be hyper feminine. If we're just casual, if we don't put on this extra makeup, do our hair, we will always be categorized as more masculine, even the most femme Black women I know, because apparently we're more outspoken, we're more like loud, people assign masculinity to us. So even when I'm trying to be feminine, I'm still seen in more of a masculine way. And when I'm masculine, it's too masculine because they see Black men as a threat, as aggressive. So I'm trying to find a balance between these things where I'm not presenting in a way that's threatening people. And I'm also, I don't know how to express my gender through my physical self. So I know like, I shouldn't care what people looking outside can see, but it keeps me safe. So that's the main thing is I'm trying to fly under the radar as much as I can. That didn't really work out, but that's kind of how it goes.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing. And of course, bringing up the point about safety as well, right? Like that does play a very big role in, you feel a certain way, but you still have to present a certain way in order to feel safe walking out into the community. So that really does bring up an important point for sure. GR, maybe you want to go next?
Can you remind me what the question was? Sorry.
Just asking how the intersections of your identities have either complicated, challenged, or just play a general role in existing in this world, both as a queer person and as.
For sure. I feel like I've had a lot of different shifts in identity over the years. The joke is kind of like, how many more coming outs will I have? Of just being like, coming out as like first time bisexual, and then it's like, no, I'm a lesbian, and then, oh nope, I'm gonna change my name and I'm gender fluid, and then it's like, no, I'm trans and I use they them pronouns, and oh, I guess I'm pansexual and bisexual again, and like, so just kind of like is ever fluid and shifting over many years, right? So that in and of itself has means I've experienced a lot of different things, based on like, if people see me as more masculine or more feminine. So I can relate to what Sonia was saying, of just being like, at one point, really being like a proud butch lesbian, um and being more masculine, and like the privileges that gave me, and also like it's like a double-edged sword of like, you get the privileges but only if you're going to be misogynistic to other women as well, and then you're part of the boys club, but then we're also going to erase your femininity completely. So then I felt like I couldn't even be feminine, because then you lose again all that privilege and this and that. So it's like this double-edged sort of like privilege and erasure all in one kind of swoop, um and then becoming, um realizing that I'm trans, and then my body shape changing, and all this stuff, and changing my pronouns and this and that. That was really hard. Like, people really don't want, like, they really resist wanting to use your new current name, and they kind of, especially if they're drinking, like, they go to their way to make sure that that they know what your real name is, and da 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 da. And then people resist pronouns and this and that. So it's a process that takes years. I feel like I'm still going through some of those processes as well. Um, and then now becoming a more like masculine looking person, where like my desire was never to be a man. I don't feel like a man. I don't want to be a man. But when people see you that way, it's kind of the same thing again, where you're allotted these privileges, but the expectation is that you uphold patriarchy and you uphold misogyny and uphold all those things. So I feel at the same time, like, there are these privileges that I get, but also that my identity is being completely erased again. So it's kind of like this very weird thing. And also, like, because I don't want to uphold patriarchy, I remember what it's like to be treated as lesser than, as I failed to say before that, like, I'm a trans two-spirit artist. I'm non-binary. That what happens is, people want to, like, men want to bro down with you, and they want to, like, they really want you to be on their side, kind of thing, like, like women, how they're like. And then meanwhile I'm in the back of the Uber, like, really trying to, like, give this person basically a therapy session to be like, actually I think it's actually your issue. I don't think it's your girlfriend's issue, and here's why. So I'm like traveling and from airports to venues and this and that, and then these dudes want to bro down, and you just have to say, like, no, here's actually what the problem is, and then being like, huh, and you're like, goodbye, and you close the car door, and you're like, wonder who I'll talk to next. So and that's just from people seeing me as a like white man, but I'm not. I'm a white coated indigenous person, and that identity even came later on because of colonization, of not being connected to my community, being connected to my family, being like 18 years old, and then realizing, okay, this is a part of me now. And that actually answers a lot of questions I had about myself, and was this really, like, wonderful thing, but also just being like, now what do I do with this? And in the same way of, like, having a friend say, I think you should identify as two-spirit, and me being like, I don't know what to do with that though, and trying to learn as much as possible, and just so the effects of colonization on that. So all this to say that, like, the more intersections you add, it's always this kind of like, maybe not always, but for me, my experience has been like, and you gain some privileges, but then you also get some negatives for erasure, negatives for all this other stuff, that all these strings attached with masculinity and all these strings attached with this and that. And so it's complicated. I guess the short answer is it's complicated, and it's like this beautiful thing, and it's also this really hard thing. But I think what it means is that you have to be really honest with yourself about like, okay, now I'm trans, but it's like realizing like, oh, I'm actually in this society that is steeped in transphobia because of misogyny and sexism. So you're like, okay, I got to unpack my own transphobia, and then being like, okay, well, homophobia as well. Okay, I got to unpack that too. Look where I grew up. And then unpacking like, okay, my racism of being like, I grew up in Northern Ontario. There were no Black people in my community, so I know nothing about that. And then moving to Montreal and me being like, oh shit, I got some stuff to learn because I didn't grow up in a diverse place. And if there was diversity, no one would talk about it. So there were other people who were Indigenous around me. There were people who had mixed race and mixed ancestry around me in my high school, but we just didn't talk about it. Everything was very whitewashed, from what we were learning at school to the mixed ancestry of every person who is in that school with us. So everything gets swept in the rug. We don't talk about that. We don't talk about being Indigenous. So I feel like it's complicated in the North because, like Sonia was saying, like you want to fit in and you don't want to stir the pot and all this stuff, but also like I don't just want to let things slide, and I don't want things to just be status quo, because I remember what it was like to be, again, treated like just a little girly who's going to play us a little tune, people being so misogynistic. And nowadays I'm like, I'm not going to stand for that for anybody. So yeah, anyways, I feel like
Thank you so much for sharing that. No, hey, that was really valuable. So thank you so much for sharing. And you kind of segued us once again into another question. So I can move on. I'll move on to the next question because I think it's a really wonderful segue. And in talking about, how oppression and discrimination are so deeply ingrained both within our society as well as just the structures and institutions that, we interact with on a daily basis. So this question, once again, is kind of posed to all the panelists. In your opinion, what are some of the structural and systemic issues that need to be addressed to dismantle both queer phobia and as well as these other phobias that exist within the Northern context? So I know we didn't really hear from Ashley or Tafari. If one of the two of you want to answer that. I'm gonna call him Tafari. You're smiling. Go.
Okay, I was like looking at Ashley. Like, can say something. Yeah. You got to pose the question to me one more time. Sorry.
No worries. I'm basically just asking, like, what are some of the systemic issues that need to be addressed, right? Because we know that this is so much more than just people not being nice.
Right. So. Yeah, I think, a lot of it obviously is just educating yourselves and to take it even one step further than educating, but like actually wanting to know what it's like to be somebody else and caring about other people's experiences, because we can get so wrapped up into our own lives that, we hear about systemic racism and like we see it on Instagram all the time, but it's a quick scroll through like, okay, cool, moving on, but I think it takes the actually wanting to do better, wanting to know more. And then on top of that, once you are kind of educating yourself, to be aware about educating your community and your tribe, like we've been talking about, right? So it's like, it's one thing for you personally to do the work, but then if things are still happening around you that are, going sideways, you kind of need to be the one to address it, to make sure that anyone that's kind of associated with you is going to get educated on the issues, because you now know what's going on. So you can't pretend like you don't understand. So I think that for me, that's probably the key point of it.
Perfect. Ooh, perfect. Thank you so much for sharing. Teddy, I noticed you had your hand raised. So if you don't mind answering question.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to like when it comes down to like the systems, because I do like advocacy work a lot, and a lot of it's talking about the colonial systems that impact Indigenous people, but how colonization has impacted LGBTQ people ever since contact, really, because there have been, like, even though Two-Spirit is a very modern term, that was given to Indigenous people who identify as being like LGBTQ or transgender and gender diverse. There are still so many folks who identify with other language or who may have lost that language or in those teachings and those roles because of the influences of contact and the impacts of colonization. So I think it's the one thing too is if we go back before colonization and what Indigenous communities have, and there are some communities or some Indigenous communities where gender roles are very strict or very rigid. However, that's also we also have to kind of look further into that as well, and where like different communities or different First Nations communities or tribes were influenced by colonization or the impacts of like gendered roles and like European standards of gendered roles, and it enforced that upon their own people because it was imposed onto Indigenous people. Because there's the one thing too in many First Nations communities, they're run by matriarchs, so run by women in a lot of cases. And then after contact, that had changed because women were now seen as property and seen as less than, and were seen as man. And if that's how women were viewed, how did that gender-based violence look when it came to Two-Spirit or gender diverse folks from a colonial standpoint? Because there is an elder by the name of Blue Waters and Alex, Dr. Alex Givens, and they talk about how in their different communities, if the two-spirited person was held in high regard, if they were honored, sometimes they were given certain specific roles. Some of those roles included being community greeters. So sometimes they were the first people to greet new people to their community because of like whatever traditional roles or stories or ceremonies were tied with their two-spirit teachings at the time. And it looked very different for other people. There are some folks who I've met where they never had where they don't identify as two-spirit or they never had two-spirit language within their tribes and their communities. But they do they do recognize two-spirited people being here in some way or form because a lot of times when you're talking about creation and for people, that we're all given a spirit, and our spirit is given to us before we're coming here to the physical world. And within that spirit, it gives us our gifts and our purpose and what we're supposed to be doing on this journey. And along that journey is our helpers too. So, but there's so many people who don't even understand that as a simple concept of having a spirit and whatever our spiritual aspects are. Because some people are so detached from it sometimes, because that's not what modern people always look at or value when it comes to spiritual entity or spiritual supports. So I think by looking at the context of the impacts of colonization, so by looking at like the impacts of reservation systems, treaty rights, the impacts of residential school and the 60s school, it can really start impacting like how same-sex practices or gender diversity was something that was common, that was something that was natural here, and other aspects of like colonial abuse systems, so like same-sex sexual abuse, is something that is seen as not normal, because that's basically taking power away when we're not empowering the people that have been here, that have been born who they are, and because the systems that we're a part of, our systems are not built for LGBTQ people. Our Canadian system is not built for Indigenous people. Canadian system is not built for Black people or people of color. So there's a lot of things when it comes down to talking about systems, and it talks about and the real core for me is viewing on decolonization, decolonizing our minds, decolonizing our processes, and thinking about what those processes or systems were like before contact. How did Indigenous people view gender or sexuality? How did Indigenous people view race when it came to working with folks of different nations? So I think if we start looking back at those before times, we can really start unraveling some of the processes that we need to be moving forward in a good way today.
Perfect. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I think that really helps to also to give some of the historical context to all of what we're speaking about, right? So as you could probably see in the chat, we're going to be moving on to the public Q&A section because we got so many fantastic questions that we'd like to get as many as we can in. So the first question is from Isaac, and it says, what advice would you give to your younger self? I know we have a lot of younger queer folks tuning in who live in northern communities and may feel isolated and outcast. So Ashley, do you mind maybe answering this question?
Yeah, sure. What advice would I give my younger self? I would say use the supports that are there for you. So the allies, the teachers, the people that are the most accepting and the most honest and open with you. Maybe hold on to those ones, call those ones, use those ones when people say that they are there to help or they're there to give support. When you need it, call on it, right? That's what I would say to my younger self for sure.
Great. Thank you so much. And I think kind of the next question ties into this really well. And it's by Anonymous, and it's, what advice can you offer for closeted queer folks living in the North? Can you suggest any resources or groups to participate in order to become more comfortable in being open about identifying as queer and touch on your coming out experience? So maybe Alex, we haven't heard from you in a little while. Do you mind sharing some of your thoughts on that?
Sure. You know, I think for closeted youth, there's always that sort of pressure that they need to come out, that they need to declare who they are. And I just, first off, if you are not in a safe situation, don't do it. You're on your own schedule. You decide when's the right time for you. If you don't feel safe doing it, then don't do it. And I guess, try to find, it's tough for queer youth specifically in the city because there aren't any queer spaces that are accessible to youth. There's spaces that are queer friendly or that accept them, but that aren't, catered to or that address the specific concerns and needs of queer youth. Now, I mean, there are some organizations and, there are some organizations that try to address those needs. Certainly, like Fierté every Pride week, we try to, have events for youth. TG Inner Selves organizes support groups for, trans youth. Outside of that, there aren't that many supports available or resources. But I guess this is a little bit tying into what Ashley just spoke about, is try to find your people. Queer youth today have access to limitless knowledge and resources through the internet that a lot of older queer folks didn't necessarily have access to. So even if your support network isn't there with you in person, they can definitely help guide you through through these decisions.
Thank you so much for that. And I saw here in the chat that Teddy shared some really fantastic resources. So Youthline is one, as well as PFLAG was one that was shared. And also too, I'm going to shamelessly plug this, and I know that our website is currently down, but I know that Fierté Pride is one such, and I'm sure many of the other Pride organizations in the North also have a list of fantastic resources for queer people who are living in the North to be able to access, right? So there are services available for those who do need them, and know that, you are not alone. These communities absolutely do exist and are here to support you. So just, it may be difficult, but you will absolutely be able to find your community and who will be there to support you through all of this. So I just saw the next question got sent my way. So this one's open to whoever wants to answer it. And it is, can you speak on white supremacy and racism within the queer community?
I think I could say a little bit about that.
For sure.
One thing that really bothers me within the queer community is the mockery, or I'm not sure I know the right word, but there is the stereotype of what it means to be a Black woman, or and that's used a lot of the time in what is now seen as queer language, but is actually African American vernacular English. It's, it could be kind of insulting and isolating to see that people within your community are using a stereotype of you as their supposed language and their comedy. And even online, using Black women as memes, we're not inherently funny, or Black men is this image of just stay away from stereotypes that hurt your entire community as well. And it's like, if you're coming from a place where you've been treated badly because of your queer identity, imagine what it's like to be queer and something else, you know, and just kind of own the kind of privileges you've had. Like for me, I've grown up pretty financially stable because of the kind of parents I have, and they were willing to support me. So I can't say that I have the same experience as someone who couldn't hide their identity when they were younger and they had to be separated from their families. So I honestly don't even know what to say about, like, I don't even know where to start with challenging it, because it's like, if you are a white supremacist in a queer community, you have some internal work to do. And that is completely a reflection of you and your projection onto other people, because you clearly don't understand your own identity if you could project something like that onto someone else, and you have to do your own internal work. Don't expect Black people to teach you, because there is this other situation where you're a minority inside of a minority. Forcing the one Black person you know in the queer community to teach you how to treat them, it creates more isolation for them, because now they don't feel like a friend to you. They don't feel like a community member. They feel like they're going to be targeted, tokenized, and used for the knowledge. Plus, we don't speak for everyone. I don't know what the different experience would be. If someone was trans and Black, I can't speak on that experience on behalf of everyone that looks like me. So it's just that expectation. We have resources online, free resources, even on Instagram, these little infographics that everyone reads. It just, I'm trying to keep my language PC. It makes me really angry when you see them posting like Black squares, but the next day, the things that they're posting is something just insulting, or not even just, they didn't think it through. And it would just take 2 seconds to rethink your stance and then understand how this harms people within your community. So just think about how you're feeling being isolated for the larger society, and think about the fact that other people are feeling even more isolated because of what you're doing to them and expecting from them.
For sure. Thank you so much for sharing that. So this next question, I think I'm going to pose to Teddy, because I feel like you may really want to dive deep into this one. And it's asked by Riley, and it is, what services/resources do you think are needed in Northern communities in order for queer folks to prosper and thrive?
Well, I think what we need to do is, like, we really need to start challenging some of those people within our systems who are harboring those teachings of homophobia and transphobia, and who are not being challenged enough. Because that's the one thing, when I go into different places, I always ask, like, I always think, it's like, what does an LGBTQ person look like? And they could look like anybody in this chat. What does an Indigenous person look like, or even a person of color? They can also look like anybody on this chat. But the one thing I wasn't asking all this time was, like, what does a racist person look like? What does a homophobic person or transphobic look like? And unfortunately, within the communities of, like, that I'm a part of, both the LGBTQ community, racialized communities, and the Indigenous community, a lot of those isms and obias are still present there. So again, it's like that lateral violence, right? It's kind of like a double-edged sword. So for me, I think it's like having a little bit of bravery when really challenging those folks on, like, and not even, maybe not even challenging folks. It might be like who might have suffer from diet racism or transphobia light, where they're like, I'm not transphobic, but I'm not racist. However, then I think those definitely needs to be challenged, because, like, in Ontario and in Canada, we do have protective rights for LGBTQ folks. So also reminding folks is like, hey, we can't actually say that, or you can't actually do that, because because it can be deemed offensive, and so I think for folks, it just comes down with, like, a lot of more resources and more information, but really holding people accountable to what their actions and behavior are. And especially coming to addressing different prides, where a lot of prides can be very whitewashed, where they think they're doing a great job because they're LGBTQ, but they're not being inclusive for other people, or they're not creating accessible options for others in the community. So I think it kind of goes back to, like, really tying, like, in, like, intersectionality, and, like, really keying into is, like, what does gender mean for us, and what does gender mean for us as an organization or as a community? What does sexuality or race mean to us, and what does sexuality and race mean to us personally, but also as a community too. And once we start better understanding that, we can better understand like how our tools, our systems are inadequate for those people that we're really trying to reach. And I think it's the other thing too. It's like when we're reaching out to those people, that we're doing it in a good way, and that we're honoring their time, and that we're paying them the amount that is best for them, that's comfortable for their rate, and not just like a $200 honorarium or a $50 gift card. Because sometimes what you're asking when it comes to those experiences is like you're experiencing like the strength-based approach, but you're also getting some of the trauma there. So you're asking folks to relive some of those moments. They're like, okay, that was very traumatic for you. How traumatic was for you? How could we not be traumatic for other people? I'm like, oh, thank you so much for your gift card. Now you can buy skip the dishes and eat my feelings. But that's not gonna stop the institutional racism or the institutional transphobia or discrimination that happens. So I think for me, for others, it's just for others to really be brave and to really challenge those who are unwilling to change. Because it's 2021, and there's so many examples of change out there, especially and even in Northern community, where it's nothing new. And LGBTQ people, like, we're not going anywhere. And so I think it's just people just need to adapt, because if you don't, that's the one thing, is like, if you don't accept us, whether it's your programming or whether it's a person or whether it's a family member, if we come out to you, we're asking you to continue on that journey with us. And if you cannot meet us where we're at, then we're going to continue with our journey, and we're not just going to wait for you to Grandma Google and figure out what it means to be trans or what does it mean to be LGBTQ, because we're still going to go on that journey. And if you're still stuck on how we are or what you think that we should be in your eyes, then you're going to miss out on so many parts of our journey. And hopefully those folks can meet up with us, but so many people don't. And it's the same thing with agencies. And people are like, oh, we don't have LGBTQ people here. Why aren't they here? And there's probably a really good reason why, because if I start asking around the community, I'll find out why. And then I'll tell you why, and I'll tell you how shitty you are afterwards. So
exactly. Thank you so much for sharing that, for sure. And I definitely echo those sentiments. And then I also really like how you got to the point of what this whole caucus is about, right? And you said, like, we're here to stay. And that's what we're saying, is like, no one's going anywhere. We're here to stay, and that's not going to change. So get used to it. So I noticed that Ashley, you raised your hand. I believe that was for question number 4. So I don't know if you want to talk about that a little bit yourself.
Yeah, actually, just Teddy, you were so on point with that, and everybody in this panel has been so on point with everything. And I think so, like, something I've been trying to do for the last couple of years is start some place for youth to meet each other, to learn cultural things, because I think that and it might just be me and my experience here in Thunder Bay, but there seems to be a little bit of a bottlenecking of the pollination of teachings that go on. When we look to our west, we see Winnipeg having lots of Two-Spirit powwows. We look to our east over near you guys, and that's exactly what we see. Is there's a lot of progressive movement, and I feel like having that space, I'm starting to realize now, I feel like maybe we don't need to have a space and silo everybody into a space. Maybe we need to look at the organizations that are doing things right now and say, where's your trans representation? Where's your Indigenous representation? Where are you getting feedback from? And challenging the places that are here right now, because I feel like looking at allies, like their allies are super powerful. So having that allyship and questioning those outside organizations is really important. I mean, and it's really important to have our own spaces as well. Don't get me wrong on that, but I feel like I'm starting to realize maybe there should be we should be looking other places for that inclusiveness. That's all. Yeah, thanks.
Right. I absolutely agree. And thank you so much for sharing that. So I noticed both GR and Sonia raised your hands. So we'll go to GR and then we'll go to Sonia about this question. Sound good? Perfect.
Right on. So when I'm thinking about services and resources for Northern communities for queer folks, like, if I look at it from a trans perspective, when I first moved here, I would ask around to, like, pharmacists, walk-in clinics, this and that. I'd be like, who are the trans-friendly doctors here? And people would either have no answer, or they'd be like, I'm not sure, or they'd be like uncomfortable. Sometimes people would give me a list, but then I'd like take that and I couldn't really find out more information. Like, Like, why are they trans friendly? Is it because you know that they're prescribing testosterone? Like, does that make someone inherently trans friendly? I don't know. So, like, luckily I fell into, like, I went into a walk-in clinic and this doctor didn't misgender me, didn't make assumptions about me and my partner's relationship, didn't ask me to weigh myself, didn't ask like all these weird questions. It was really great. And then was like, do you folks need a family doctor? I'd love to be your doctor. And we're like, is this real life right now? Is this really happening? So um it took us a little while to find that doctor. We were like really grateful that that happened. And I mean, I've still had to have like advocacy work with that doctor about like, hey, you're misgendering me, or like I'm seeing these communications between you and this other professional and you're misgendering me, or things like that. But all in all, it's been pretty okay. So I'm really lucky. My experience up in Yellowknife up there, it took me years and years and years and years to find a good doctor. And then finally, like, they went on sabbatical and I like wept in front of them, and they're like, I don't get it, why are you sad? And I'm like, you don't get that it took me so long to find you, and now I don't know if I'm just going to go have another crappy doctor who doesn't know anything about trans and queer health. And they're like, oh. So luckily they were able to find me another person, and they went on sabbatical, and then I found a third doctor who was pretty great, but again still had to do this advocacy work of like, they're like, well, if you take this testosterone now, like your cholesterol is going to go up, you're at a high risk for heart attack. And I'm like, so are you telling men, or folks who produce their own testosterone, to take testosterone blockers because it's such a high risk that they're going to have a heart attack, that they shouldn't have testosterone in their body? They're like, well, no. So I'm like, so why are you using this as a deterrent for me to take testosterone when it's literally going to save my life? Like, why are you putting it this way? So like, just little things like that like, and I mean, I brought that up because I know of someone else who was refused testosterone because they were like, your cholesterol's already too high, or this is already too high. And it's like, yeah, but if you don't give me the testosterone to help because I need those hormones in my body, like, it's actually going to be more detrimental. So people using, or doctors using the way things are written, almost like how you can manipulate statistics to mean something when it doesn't, they'll use that language in order to be a gatekeeper for that health for a person. So I think for me, like, when I think of services and resources that are lacking, it's always like knowing where to go for a doctor who can prescribe testosterone, where I can go. Like, I could not find proper length needles for my testosterone to inject myself here. I had to either go on Amazon, which I don't want to do because I'm just like, I don't know who's selling this to me. I have no idea what this company is. So it took me forever to find one company who had one box of the needles that I needed. And they're like, I'm not sure if we sell to individuals. We mostly just sell to medical businesses. So luckily, like, they were able to say, okay, my manager approved it, it's fine, you can pick it up, yada yada. But like, I drove around all over the place. I would call pharmacies, no one has that. That's a big deal. That's a huge, even like, there was a huge shortage of testosterone in October and November. There was none to be found in Canada of either kind. Usually one kind is not being made, so you skip over to the other one, which I can't do because I'm allergic to the other one, the oil it's suspended in. So I'm like, I can only use the one kind that's available to me. And there was a national shortage. So I had to go on a cream testosterone. It did not work for me. And I had a huge hormone crash, and I was not okay for 2 months. That's a huge thing. Like, so,
No,
and
absolutely.
supports and resources, right? So all this to say, like, trans healthcare is like, people are falling through the cracks. And I'm not super familiar with the trans community here. I would like to know more. But just my experiences of first moving back here, and if I can even jump off my experiences from further up north in Yellowknife, like, people are falling through the cracks, and it's totally preventable stuff, preventable deaths, preventable suffering. So, and then even if I can go back to the question before that of like resources, like, if you were going to give advice to youth or this or that, like your feelings right now, like, they're super duper valid. And if you're feeling sad and you're feeling depressed, like, there's a reason for that, and that's totally valid. And I hope you can just, like, you keep holding on, because it's not always going to be that way. I can tell you that because I've been through it. It's not always going to be that way. You can be happy, you will be happy, you will have friendships, you will have relationships that are beautiful with people. And you know what? Like, if you're trans right now in a community or queer right now and you don't know where to go, like, you can find me on Facebook and you can message me and you can just say, hey, I think I'm trans. What do I do? You know, I've had people do that and they've turned into really amazing friendships that I had. And that's what I needed to at those moments. And I was able to reach out to other people that were publicly queer or trans, and it saved my life. So I think if people, you know, if you find me on Facebook or Instagram and you send me a message or saying, hey, I'm a youth, I'm trans, I'm queer, I'm having a hard time, like, I'll try and send you resources, or I'll just literally just tell you, like, you matter, you're okay. You're going to be okay. So, yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing that. That was really powerful. And I think you really touched on an issue that many trans folks, especially living in Northern Ontario, do face, and that is finding healthcare, right? And finding people who are going to be trans friendly and who are going to be queer friendly, and know how to treat individuals within the community, because they're very distinct healthcare needs. So thank you so much for sharing. I really appreciate that. Sonia, you had your hand up next. Do you mind sharing?
I don't mind sharing. I'm trying not to cry from hearing everything that Grayson just said. But oh my goodness. Okay, yeah, for resources, you know, the main thing I'm thinking of is, you know, sex ed is already terrible for anyone. The idea that sex is still shameful in our community, in any community, you know, is holding us back, is holding us all back. The way that people treat sex workers, the way that people in the queer community even treat sex workers is holding us back, because they have the education. They're the ones who have to deal with, you know, all these people that are repressed, and like, at the same time, they're shunned from our communities. So bringing in that sex education from a younger age will let people feel less shame, and people who have internalized it and therefore projected as bullying, they have less of a reason to bully people and to hurt people from a young age, because that education is there. It's not mystical. It's not like scary. And, you know, that education is really needed, but also homelessness resources, because a lot of people are kicked out of their homes at a very young age. They can't find the community. And it's harder when you're living on the streets, or you don't have a permanent space to occupy. Then you have to hide your identity all the time, because who knows what kind of shelter you're going to be in, with what kind of people you're going to be in that could hurt you. And so I think the idea of like finding a space to house people that have been removed from their families because of their identities, that needs to be a little bit more touched on. Yeah, and you know, it's good to be the person that people come to. I would say that if you're an ally to trans people, to the queer community in general, it's your duty to have the resources. We can't always engage with this material because you know, the internalized homophobia that a lot of us have, and internalized transphobia that a lot of us have, it makes it so that these conversations we're having right now, it's really political, it's really like intense, like I'm holding back tears. But if you're an ally and you come to me, I might not be able to engage in that conversation. So look for people who are able to engage in that conversation, or be that person to queer people in your community, that they could say, oh, I know that this ally has resources. I know that this ally is trusted. I know that this person, as a school teacher, you can be the person that they come to. I need resources. You bring it up before they have to bring it to you, because it's harder as the queer person to go up to an ally to ask for help. You should be the one opening up that conversation within your friend groups, within your profession, and it's the basics, right? Whatever corner you occupy, it's your job to make it easier for queer people to have those conversations.
For sure. Thank you so much. You touched on some really important points that I think are really helpful to this conversation. So we are getting to the end, but there's one question that I would really like to touch on. And this is by Shayna. And so Shayna says, you're all amazing and this panel is fierce. Wondering, how do you imagine our glorious queer futures? So putting yourself into this ideal world for a second, if we lived in a world where all of your identities were respected, what would it look like? So anyone can kind of just, use the raise your hand feature. I like that one. Oh, Alex, yeah, go right ahead.
I think, first off, we could start by flinging the queer phobes and the fascists into the sun. I think that would be like a good starting point. But really, like, I could see Sudbury as like this queer utopia where there's all of the capitalist system and the its impact it has on our lives, and the structural and systemic barriers it throws up have been totally eradicated, and folks who are young folks who are worried about being thrown out of their house don't have to worry about it because they can, they have services, they have resources that they can access. No one is, dealing with homelessness or poverty. I think, if we're thinking of like a queer future, we have to look at, yes, what is affecting the queer community, but a lot of the things that are affecting the queer community are the same issues that are affecting everyone else, and they're just compounded and exacerbated by queerness and by different marginalized identities. So, if we can address those, that's a good starting point. And then from there, you build a coalition. You have all of the marginalized folks and groups working together, speaking together, having a stronger impact and presenting a united front. Because in the end, if there's so much intersectionality between, or intersecting identities between the groups, that even if I'm fighting for queer liberation, that can't happen until Indigenous folks are liberated, that Black folks or people of color, and that everyone can sort of benefit from the movement.
For sure. Thank you so much for sharing that. And absolutely, I agree with you on those fronts. Sonia, did you have your hand up? Wanted to speak on that?
Yeah, I did. Sorry, I actually forgot in the middle of thinking.
No worries.
What was the question? Oh yeah, the future. I was thinking that the art would be very different. Right now the art world is known as very exclusive, and they're not really open to newness as much as they claim to be. There is this very like, you have to have the right kind of connections to be a real artist. But what happens when filmmakers, painters, and all these different people who are traditionally excluded from these communities, how will art look different? Like, don't you want to hear new stories? So we're going to have all these new stories that are actually really old stories, but just haven't been heard before. We're going to have our own history recorded. We're going to have high quality content coming out that has just never been seen or heard before stories. And those intersections are going to come out within our art, within our film. And people are just going to have to accept that this is equal. But, the problem too is when you're thinking about films now, I find it really hard to critique movies that are made by Black people. I will not engage in critique. I'm sorry. If there's a white person that doesn't like a movie that was made by a black writer, I'm not ready to have that conversation. I will stand for that, but that's only because we aren't on equal playing fields. We don't have the same resources, so I'm not willing to critique that yet. But once we get to a future where we're all on equal playing fields by some miracle, then we can bring in those critiques. We can evolve as a community and actually see how beautiful our art can be. Because even now, making work in the closet, making art like in a hidden community, we have a lot of strong artists because of the suffering and the secrecy, and so the content is already rich. But what would that look like if we were out in the open and we were actually allowed to evolve and be critiqued and enjoy different stories?
Thank you so much for sharing. I really appreciate it. And unfortunately, I'm looking at the time. We are running out of it. I wish that we could continue this conversation forever, but alas, we have to move on to the next panel. I just want to take this time to personally thank all of the panelists for speaking today, your insights and just sharing your experiences. It has been an invaluable experience that I know that attendees and those who are tuning in will have benefited and learned from. So thank you. And to those who have joined us today, thank you so much. And I hope you take something from this and move forward with it. And yeah, we'll move on to the end of the panel. Thank you again.
Thank you, Katlyn, and all our panelists for cultivating such an exciting discussion. I sincerely hope that everyone enjoyed themselves. As a reminder, keep an eye open for our follow-up survey and an opportunity to be entered for a chance to win a prize pack of items showcasing the beautiful art of Caucus artist Sonia Ekiyor-Katimi. After a brief break, we'll be back with Nadmadwin, Black and Indigenous Solidarity at 4:30 p.m. For Northern Caucus information, please consult our virtual event booklet and stay tuned to our social media. Thank you again to our sponsors, Cambrian College, Canadian Mental Health Association Sudbury Manitoulin, Centre de Santé Communautaire du Grand Sudbury, Centre Victoria pour Femmes, Collège Boréal, Galerie du Nouvel Ontario, Greater Sudbury Public Library, Laurentian University Université Laurentienne, Public Health Sudbury and Districts, Réseau Access Network, Société Alzheimer's Society, Sudbury Action Centre for Youth, Thornhill University Women's Gender Sexuality Studies Department. And remember, Here to Stay Baby is not only the header of this event, but a battle cry for marginalized communities residing in Northern Ontario. Our lives have value, we belong, we are here to stay, baby. Thank you for joining us and have a splendid rest of the day.